Good evening, and welcome to Restored Lore, your home for old, odd, and obscure stories. Tonight we continue our holiday reading of Tinsley's 1869 Christmas Annual, 13 at Table, the story of a dinner that was never eaten. The story plays out a bit like an old-fashioned murder mystery. 13 people receive unexpected letters inviting them to the reading of a will and the distribution of an inheritance. The characters are wildly different, and each part of the story explains the character and their backstory as they take this sudden journey. This is the third video in the series. If you haven't listened to the first part, you can use the link on screen or in the description below to get caught up. Because each part describes a different character, they don't have to be listened to in order, but the first part provides the context for what follows, and really should be listened to first. Now, let's open our imaginations and begin. Of the third lady's second husband, who did not come at all. Mr. Todger Phipson was a fair young man with very long legs. The legs seemed as if they had grown out of all proportion to his body and were weak in consequence. They were too long for the size of his head, which was small, and would have looked smaller but for the abundance of his hair and whiskers. Altogether there was about Mr. Todger Phipson the air of a man who did not quite belong to himself. There was a want of fitness in him. He was not plain, and he dressed well, so that in repose he was not much amiss, but when he walked it was another matter. There was something then quite absurd in his very long, shaky legs. At 25 he fell in love, and, as his mind resembled his legs in a peculiar want of decision, he could not decide which he preferred of the three Misses Mantolli. They were not a bit alike, but he thought them all charming. Blanche, the eldest, was small and sparkling, with bright dark eyes and hair, a sort of face suggestive of Christmas and holly berries and all the glow and lustre of the joyful season. Next came Julia, tall and dashing, with a certain air of determination about her. She was the beauty of the family, and she knew it, and always dressed to show off the proportions of her exquisite figure, a girl artists raved about, with an arm which might have served as a model for the Venus of Milo. The third Miss Mantolli was called Selina. Lena, her sisters named her, and it certainly is a much prettier name. Lena did not set up for beauty. She had a little fair face, with fair hair in a sort of cloud about it, and large grey eyes with long lashes that cast a shadow over the said eyes and made you feel you must look close to decide what their real colour was. These grey eyes were all Lena had to boast of. She was freckled, she had bright scarlet lips, but her mouth was wide, and she had a little impertinent turn-up nose. There was scarcely any likeness among these sisters, except that they all had good complexions, and Blanche and Julia had hair of the same colour. Mr. Todger Phipson had danced with all three, one after another, earlier in the year, and then he had met them at a lawn party, and had fallen in love with all three. "I don't know what to do. It's a confounded bore. Why need they all go out together? It leaves a fellow no chance of making up his mind. Julia is the handsomest, no doubt about it, but then if I take Julia I shall be fancying Blanche is the most loving." And he sat pulling out his long fair whiskers for full 10 minutes. "After all, I believe that little Lena is the most amusing. She's such a dear, saucy little thing, and a wife ought to be able to amuse a fellow on a wet Sunday, and so on. Julia's handsome, a distinguished sort of girl altogether, but those are just the sort of women who turn into bores. They want so much dress and attention, nothing easy-going about them. It's an awful bother." Here Mr. Todger Phipson got up and began to pace his room with long, shaky strides. "Why on earth can't women settle these things? It's confoundedly hard a fellow should have to make up his own mind." It seemed to Mr. Todger Phipson that, on the whole, it would be advisable to choose that one of the Misses Mantolli who would be most likely to be attentive to him. "I shall be very fond of her. Why, I'm fond of all three of 'em already. But my wife must be thoroughly attached to me. I shall expect her to settle everything. Of course—" Here Mr. Todger Phipson went back to his easy-chair, having looked at himself in the glass over the fireplace. "One knows well enough in these days. One has only to choose. The girls are quite ready." Mr. Phipson had a good deal of ha-ha in his way of speaking. It sounded as if he were always clearing the way for some extra valuable observations which never came. The Misses Mantali lived with their father in a very unfashionable place indeed, but they really lived there, Russell Square. I believe a good many girls with expectations live in Russell Square. The Mantalis did not expect too much from their father, but they had a rich cousin, Mr. Brown. Cousins, as you know, are not much. They have such a way of changing their minds late in life and taking to housekeepers and hospitals. "I know what I'll do," said Phipson, standing quite erect for once on his long shaky legs. "I'll call, and whichever of the Mantalis I find at home, I'll propose to." It is a far less nervous business to be in love with 3 women at once than only one. Mr. Todger Phipson managed to walk into the drawing-room at Russell Square with sufficient self-possession, but it was very disconcerting to find all 3 sisters there together, all looking charming, all glad to see him. He stayed some time, but they evidently did not suspect his intentions, or, if they did, they had no intention of furthering them. There was no chance of a tete-a-tete. "It's an awful bother," said Phipson to himself as he reached his chambers. "And I don't exactly see how one's to get out of it. Perhaps they're always together. I suppose one couldn't speak to one before the other 2, could one?" He stopped and pulled out his whiskers by way of counsel. "Well, no, I fancy not, because if the first wasn't willing or anything of that sort, the others might feel huffed not to have been asked first. And I really don't care which it is," he said with strong emphasis. "I don't, really now." Mr. Todger Phipson went to bed, but he could not sleep. The Misses Mantali were too disturbing, and, strangely enough, the one he had thought of the least, that insignificant Lena with the great shadowed eyes and the turned-up nose, was the most tormenting of the 3. "By Jove, I'll call again on Sunday, and I'll not leave the house until it's done." A decision with Mr. Phipson was so rare an occurrence that its effect was overpowering. He fell asleep at once from pure exhaustion. Sunday morning came. Mr. Phipson overslept himself and spent the interval between his breakfast and his visit in making cigarettes with an ingenious little machine he had purchased in Oxford Street. "Clever fellows, these Frenchmen," said Phipson as he made up his 12th cigarette. "So much mind in all they do. A most scientific little invention, that." He took out a pair of new gloves, brushed his hat with extra care, and went in a hansom to Russell Square. "Not in from church yet, sir?" the footman said. "Will you come in and wait, sir? They won't be long." Mr. Phipson hesitated. This seemed a very decided step, but the footman held the door open in such a peremptory manner that he went in. The chairs and sofas in the drawing-room were, to Mr. Phipson, as uncomfortable as the wooden stools in the story of the 3 bears proved to the very inquisitive little boy who tried them. He went from one to another. His legs grew more and more wangly and limp, and his whiskers straightened as his chin drooped. At last the door was thrown open, and in walked all the Misses Mantali. "Good gracious," said Todger Phipson. "I never can do it." "We are going out of town tomorrow," said Blanche. "I'm so glad you came today. We are going to Brighton with Papa." Brighton! Just the place where girls like the Mantalis were sure to be seen and admired. If only they would have stayed on in London at this dull time of year, they would have been safe. "And I should have had some time to decide," groaned Phipson. He was more puzzled than ever today. Blanche had something red in her bonnet, and with her veil drooping over half her eyes, she looked bewitching. Julia was handsomer than ever in her sealskin and velvet. Lena, perhaps, was a shade less attractive than usual. She looked so very cold, There's no help for it, he thought. If I don't have one or the other, I shall go distracted. The door opened again. Captain Lucas and Mr. Broughton. In came two gentlemen, and the Misses Mantali looked radiant. Todger Phipson felt himself eclipsed. He pulled a letter out of his pocket, tore 3 slips of paper from the envelope, and twisted them up differently. He named the first Blanche, the second Julia, and the third Lena, then dropped them into his hat. He looked around. All the 3 sisters were still devoted to Captain Lucas and Mr. Broughton, especially Selina and Julia. No one was looking at Todger Phipson. He shut his eyes and drew a lot. It was Julia. By Jove, and she's the only one who makes me nervous. Well, she's much the best looking, and if one has to go about with one's wife at all, it's just as well to have that sort of woman. But, good gracious, how is it to be done? It seemed as if fortune was going to help him. Lena asked Mr. Broughton to look at that love of a fern in the conservatory, and Blanche looked at Julia. Have you shown Captain Lucas your new photograph? Julia looked haughty. No, she said carelessly. I don't know where it is. Blanche rose and went to the farther end of the long back drawing-room. The captain followed her. Todger Phipson found himself quite alone with Julia Mantali. She looked pale and pensive. He thought very handsome, too. Miss Mantali? Julia looked up, and Todger Phipson was startled. She looked down again directly, and he went on, Dear Miss Mantali, circumstances must excuse abruptness. He had made this up and got it by heart in the hansom. But I can no longer live happy without you. And then he stopped, gasping. Dear me, he thought, how hot the room is. If one could only do it like écarté, I propose, I accept. But Julia Mantali said something else. You are very kind, Mr. Phipson, but I am not free now. I am engaged to Captain Lucas. Then she got up and walked into the other room. Oh, thank heaven, said Phipson as he watched her stately steps. There's something too commanding about her. I believe if I could only make up my mind, I'd like Lena best. Obedience was Mr. Phipson's crowning virtue. If you had taken him to the top of the monument and asked him to decide whether it would be best to come down or remain where he was, he would possibly have stayed at the top. But if you had told him that it was his destiny to go up and down the monument 20 times in one day, he would not have shirked a single ascent. He was resolved now to let fate decide for him. He had put the other 2 lots in his waistcoat pocket. He drew one quietly out and looked at it. It was Lena. Bravo, said Todger Phipson, and, as if by magic, Lena came into the front room. The trio were still busy over their photographs. Lena had just said goodbye to Mr. Broughton in the conservatory. She looked agitated. Todger Phipson felt more excited this time. He rose up and met Lena before she had time to cross the room. Miss Mantali, can I say a few words to you? Murmured Todger Phipson. Oh, yes, certainly. Lena hardly knew what she said. She had just accepted Mr. Broughton, and she was in love with all the world at that moment. But will you say yes? Said Phipson tenderly. He felt much more nervous than he had felt with Julia. He really was in love with this dear little girl. Very likely. And Lena looked up merrily into Todger Phipson's eyes, such a long way above her own. She blushed at what she saw there, in a sweet confusion that made her distracting. Oh, Mr. Phipson, I don't quite know. Ah, said Todger desperately. Yes, I understand. You're like me. I never do quite know. But I know I love you, and I want you to say the same. Lena looked sweetly ingenuous. Girls of her type have a way of doing it. Oh, Dear Mr. Phipson, I'm so sorry. I never thought, of you in this way, and only now, only just now, I've engaged myself to Mr. Broughton. It can't be helped, can it?" And she looked into Phipson's eyes with sweet, pleading helplessness. "Can't it? Dear me," said poor Phipson, for once putting his shoulder faintly against the wheel of fate. "Can't it, Lena?" "No, no, too late now," said the soft little creature, and then she sighed and went off to join her sisters. Todger Phipson feebly ground his teeth, and then a bright thought came to help him. His love had made him sentimental. "It's like those, what do you call 'em, in The Merchant of Venice, and that third choice there was the right one. I'm not sure Blanche isn't prettier than Lena, and perhaps she'll care more for a fellow." He had grown callous by this time. He waited and waited till Julia went with Captain Lucas to call on his sister, and then he walked up to Blanche and asked her if he could speak to her alone. He need not have asked this, for Lena had not come near him since his proposal, and Blanche had been talking to him as if to make amends for her neglect. She blushed and smiled, and went on blushing and smiling till he had asked her to be his wife. Then she spoke of her papa, who, as Todger Phipson well knew, had been quietly out of his mind for years and was not likely to interfere. And then she asked him to come downstairs to luncheon, and he went. "It's done now," said Phipson when he got home again. "I wish it wasn't. I think, if I should be quite sure, that I prefer Lena." Next day he travelled down to Brighton with the young ladies and their father. They went to the Grand Hotel, and so did he. But when he had parted from the ladies, he walked down to the sea in a very perplexed state of mind. Blanche Van Tolly had asked him to help her choose a bonnet. "If this sort of thing's to go on, said Todger Phipson, apostrophizing the waves, "why, it'll use a fellow up in no time. I never can decide on my own trousers. Why, one of the uses of a wife is to settle everything. Good heavens, she'll be asking me to choose her gowns next." Next day, as he was coming downstairs, he met Lena going up. "Has Blanche told you?" she said. "Told me what? Good gracious me," he said to himself. "She wants me to settle something else for her." "Well, it is a secret," said Lena reflectively. "But you are almost one of the family, so you must know. It's broken off between Julia and Captain Lucas." Todger Phipson whistled. He went on whistling till he reached the bottom of the stairs. "She'll do much better for me than Blanche," he said to himself. "She's the sort of woman who'll be sure to choose her own bonnets." He went into the coffee room and wrote a note to Blanche. He said he felt sure he could not make her happy in the way she wished. It was better for them both to marry people of a decided way of thinking. "Don't you think so?" he ended. "I really wish she would say so and settle it." Poor Blanche. She really cared about him, but felt sure he preferred Julia, and she had always given way to Julia, so she accepted his rejection. Todger Phipson wrote another note to Julia. "If you'll accept me," he said, "you shall always settle everything your own way." This was just the point on which Julia and Captain Lucas had quarreled. He had asked her to stay in London, and she had persisted in going to Brighton. She had always been considered before Blanche, so it did not occur to her to consult Blanche now. Julia accepted Todger Phipson. Before they left Brighton, Lena flirted so desperately with Michael Cassidy that Mr. Broughton would not stand it. They quarreled, and their engagement came to an end. When Todger Phipson learned this news, he walked up and down a lonely part of the beach, injuring his whiskers and cursing his fate. "This all comes of deciding," he said. "I know now that Lena's the only one of the three I ever wanted. If I'd just let things settle themselves, I might have had her." He tried to make up his mind to write to Julia and get set free from his promise, but he could not decide on doing it. There was a decided tone and manner about the second Miss Mantolli which kept those who knew her in check. Besides, Todger Phipson had done more in the way of deciding during the last month than he had done all his life before, and in consequence his legs were more shaky than ever. Todger Phipson had been educated for the bar and had chambers in the Temple, but he had never found anything to do there except the manufacture of weak papers for magazines and slashing notices on novels. When he went back to town, however, he found business awaiting him, business relating to property in the south of France, which would involve much careful research into old family archives. If he went himself, he should get change of scene and save expense. It would take him 6 months at least, and he would get well paid for his trouble. He consulted Julia, and she decided that he had better go. The place he went to was called Villefranche. It was about as out of the way and uncivilized a place as you could wish to see. The work among the old papers was interesting, or Todger Phipson must have been bored to death. The principal person in the place was a marquise, the Marquise de la Roche, an old man with white hair who wore patched trousers and had a mud floor in his sitting room. The room had been boarded once, but the old gentleman received such constant visits from his pigs and his poultry that the mud had got the upper hand and hardened into a permanent carpet. The Marquise wore earrings, but he dispensed with pocket handkerchiefs and took snuff out of a gold snuff-box with a portrait of Louis XV on the top. "Picturesque person, very," said Todger Phipson one afternoon, when the old gentleman had pressed him affectionately to share his dinner. "But if he's his own cook, and I strongly suspect he is, I'd rather be excused." It was a fine bright afternoon, and instead of going home to his dusty books, he strolled out of the town, sat down, and sketched some laundresses with pretty caps and ugly faces toiling up from the river with their buckets of freshly washed linen. Then came a timber cart drawn by oxen, gay with scarlet fringes and tinkling glittering bells, and Todger Phipson booked one of the oxen. And lastly came the postman with his greasy leather wallet and his long iron-shod staff. "Here, you, garçon facteur, arrêtez, stop, stand and deliver." The man grinned. He knew the English milord with the long shaky legs, and he pulled a letter out of his wallet and gave it to Todger Phipson. It was from Julia Mantolli. "Dear Mr. Phipson." "I say," said the lover, "it used to be dearest Todger. What's been happening?" He felt a strange sensation of relief, and he thought directly of Lena's eyes looking through her straggling hair. "At the time of our engagement, you may perhaps remember that you asked me always to decide for you. I think you will say that I have always endeavored to fulfill your wish, and therefore it seems to me well to decide now on ending our engagement. I'm sure we are not suited, and, as you are doubtless aware, people who don't suit can never decide for one another, but I hope we may always be friends. I am, dear Mr. Phipson, yours with every good wish, Julia Maria Mantolli." Todger Phipson threw his hat up in the air and caught it again. "What a blessing it is, after all, to have to do with a woman who knows what's good for you. Of course she sees I'm best suited to Lena. Let me see. A week more or a fortnight will settle these papers, and then I'll go back. Or I'll write." He hesitated a moment. "No, I won't write. That's deciding, and I don't want to decide anything any more." On that day fortnight, Todger Phipson found himself at Folkestone. The coffee room was almost empty. It was still early July. He took up the Times. Usually he avoided the column of births, marriages, and deaths, but an unusually long advertisement caught his notice, and he read it. First came the church and the names of the clergy, and then the marriage of Blanche Mantolli to Adolphus Broughton, of Julia to Captain Lucas, and of Selina to Michael Cassidy. The paper fell out of Todger Phipson's hands, and he fell back in his chair. Poor fellow, it was very hard. He really had cared about Lena. And to think that, if he had only stayed in England and broken off with Julia, he might now be the husband of her youngest sister, was more than he could bear. It was, on the whole, fortunate that he was compelled to go back to London on account of this French business, or he might have been driven to do something desperate. As it was, he shut himself up in his chambers and worked doggedly. One day in the Strand he met Mr. Mantali. "All well, I hope?" Todger Phipson spoke nervously. The old man had got mourning on. "My daughters are all as well as can be expected, thank you. I've got the poor things in Russell Square again." Todger Phipson's heart had gone down into its boots, but it came up again now and stuck in his throat. I don't quite make out," he stammered. "Have you not heard? Bless me, how very extraordinary. Why, it happened 3 months back, just after the wedding, you know. Dear me, how very extraordinary. Very so indeed. I thought all London knew. Bless my soul." Todger Phipson didn't bless Mr. Mantali. He very nearly cursed him for not speaking out. "I say, what's happened? Can't you tell a fellow?" He bent down over Mr. Mantali, who was short, and he longed to shake him. "They all went out in a boat, you know, all at once. I can't tell you what happened. No one can, you know, because they kept it all to themselves. They all went out in one boat, all together, and they all came home separate. The boat washed ashore at one place, and all three apart, one after the other. It's very sad, isn't it? Julia bears up the best, but it's very trying, I can assure you. Come and see us, Mr. Phipson. We shall be pleased, I'm sure." "This is a very extraordinary world," said Todger Phipson to himself. "I'm sure within the last 9 months I've had ups and downs enough to last for 9 years. I expect the world feels it's getting old, so events are crowding up. In fact, they know they have not got a chance of happening else. I expect it's steam. No one gets used to moving about so fast that everything else has to move at the same rate. I wonder how soon a widow thinks of a second husband. I'll be shot if I decide again. They must settle for me. One of the others will tell me how soon I can speak to Lena." Mr. Mantali went home and told his daughters that he had met Todger Phipson, and then he left the 3 ladies together in the drawing-room. Blanche and Julia both wore caps, very becoming caps indeed, which contrasted admirably with their rich dark hair. Lena had not a cap. She was unhappy enough without it, she said, and besides it spoiled her hair, and poor dear Michael had been so fond of her hair. "I wish Papa had not asked Todger Phipson to call," said Julia, and she threw back her head haughtily. "Well, I don't know. We see no one, and really it is very, very dull." Blanche yawned wearily. She had not cared for her husband, and she had no memories to go back to. "What do you think, Lena?" she said to Mrs. Cassidy, who sat drearily in a corner of the room by herself. Lena looked very white and wretched. "Dull? Oh, I'd rather be dull, wouldn't you?" And then the poor little thing hid her great swimming eyes in her pocket handkerchief. Julia felt called on to expostulate. "We ought not to consider our likes and dislikes," she said, with majestic wisdom. "We have to consider our duties to life and to society. I'm not sure Blanche isn't right. I believe the admission of an old friend like Todger Phipson is a very judicious act. He used to be very fond of you, Lena." "Don't," said poor Lena. She got up and went away. She really had loved Michael Cassidy. "Giving way is so weak," said Julia. "And really, so badly off as Lena is left, the sooner she thinks of marrying again, the better." "I think so too," said Blanche. She had been left with a comfortable income. "But, Julia, I cannot see why Todger Phipson should be given to Lena." "My dear, he won't have you. He tried you once and gave you up." Blanche held her tongue. She was quite snuffed out. Todger Phipson called. He saw Mrs. Broughton and Mrs. Lucas. Mrs. Cassidy stayed upstairs during his visit. "She was so devoted to poor Michael," Blanche whispered to Phipson. Julia overheard, and her eyebrows met in a heavy frown. Todger Phipson called again, and this time Lena was in the drawing-room. "By Jove," said Phipson to himself. "She's lost all her looks. There isn't the ghost of a laugh in her. I declare I like either of the others as well. Confound it all, what is a fellow to do? Can't anyone tell me which I like best?" He went home and thought it over, but it was getting too much for him. He grew pale and thin. He stayed away from Russell Square, trying to make up his mind. At last he got a note from Julia Lucas, asking him to dinner. He found all three sisters together. "Papa is dining with our cousin, Mr. Brown," said Blanche. "But dear me, Mr. Phipson, I hope you're not ill. You look so thin." Todger Phipson gave her a haggard, despairing glance. Then he looked at Lena, then at Julia. Something in her face drew him on to confidence. "My dear friends," he said, "I'm very much worried. I'm not sure that I'm not being worried to death. The best way seems to ask you to help me out of my trouble, as you have all had a hand in causing it." Todger Phipson felt very faint as he said this. It seemed such a decided step, but as he remained sitting, no one saw his legs shake. In reality, they nearly shook themselves off. "We shall only be too glad," said Julia, and Blanche murmured, "So glad," and looked up softly into Todger Phipson's eyes. I love you all three," gasped Phipson, "and yet I can't, for the life of me, tell which I love best. What's a fellow to do?" For the first time since her husband's death, Lena burst out laughing, but she put her handkerchief to her eyes to hide it. Blanche blushed, and Julia looked motherly and compassionate. She was the only one of the three who had grown matronly by marriage. "You want us to decide," she said. You see, she had the advantage of being used to Mr. Phipson. "Exactly," said Phipson. "If you only can do that, you'll earn my everlasting gratitude." Julia thought for a few moments. "I think we can settle this best by ourselves," she said. "Suppose we go down to dinner, Mr. Phipson, and tell you our decision by and by." "Just as you please. I can't tell you how obliged I am." And then he added timidly, "Wouldn't it save you trouble if you tossed up which it should be?" They all laughed. The idea was so absurd. And yet, when they came upstairs again, Julia proposed to act upon it. "No, indeed," said Lena. "You may leave me quite out of the matter. Todger Phipson is not a man I could think of for one moment. Besides, the memory of my poor, dear, lost Michael—" She burst into tears and moved to the end of the room. "I say, Julia," Blanche had been turning the matter over mentally, "I think this chance work is foolish. Lena, you see, won't have anything to do with it at all. You don't care about him, you know you don't, or you wouldn't have thrown him over as you did. And I really think I could make him happy. I always liked him." Julia looked at her sister in open-eyed amazement. "There is something wonderful in widowhood," she said to herself. "It teaches a woman to say what she means." And for a moment she was tempted to give way to Blanche's wishes. Only for a moment, and then she saw the folly of this plan. Todger had jilted Blanche, and therefore was not likely to be satisfied with such an arrangement, and besides, of all three, Blanche had the least need of a husband. She was well provided for. "Lena or I," thought Julia, and then she answered her sister. "My dear, I don't think this is a question of inclination at all, and therefore I shall not take any notice of what Lena said just now. Todger Phipson is not rich, but he has enough to live on, and therefore I propose we all toss up for him. Which is he to be, heads or tails?" This question, and some others of equal importance, having been settled, Todger Phipson was tossed for, and Julia won him. Blanche looked flushed and vexed. "Such waste," she murmured. "Why, she tried him once and gave him up." And Julia, too, now that he really belonged to her again, recalled Todger Phipson's vacillating ways and sighed. Lena was the only contented person. "You'll manage him and make him happy, Julia," she said. "Blanche would worry him to death, and I should tease him out of his senses." She took upon herself the duty of telling the news to Mr. Phipson when he came upstairs. "Why, I declare, you don't look happy," she said. "I can't look what I don't feel," he said sulkily. "But if you are satisfied, I suppose it's all right." His eyes told Lena his meaning, and she did not repeat this speech to Julia. "I couldn't love him if I tried," said Lena. "And he'll soon get fond of Julia." They went to France for their marriage trip, to Paris first, and spent Christmas there. "By Jove," said Todger Phipson when they had been 10 days in Paris. "I'd no idea money could go so fast. Money's just one of the things I don't want help in spending. Things can't go on like this. I don't see how we can do with less. The only way is to get more. I'll speak to Julia." Julia said the way was easy. "When we go back, you must try and get an appointment somewhere. There's our cousin Mr. Brown. He might get you something. Or your relation Mr. White. I've been told he's as rich as possible. But, dear, do come out now. I want you to go to Worth's with me." Todger Phipson groaned. "You'll have to decide, you know, whether it's to be white or brown." "What, my mantle? Black, of course." Next morning, before he had decided whether he should write to Mr. White or Mr. Brown, came a letter from Mr. White's lawyer, an invitation to Mr. White's house at 6 o'clock on the day fixed. Todger Phipson read the letter over twice and then gave it up to his wife. "It's been traveling about after us, you see," he said. "But still there's plenty of time. By Jove, it seems as if the old man had died on purpose. I say, suppose we'd better go back at once so as to be ready." "There's no occasion for that," Julia spoke with decision. "Why, we have nearly 3 weeks to spare. You'll be able to give me that bracelet now, dear." Phipson gave himself up and went and paid for the bracelet. Also, he hired a charming little carriage for Julia and was persuaded to go on to Pau. The weather was lovely for the time of year. They met plenty of friends, and the time flew. A Russian countess and her brother were charmed with Julia. At last, Julia reminded her husband that he must start next day for London. "All right," he said. "Just get the time book, settle my route for me and the train we are to start by, and we'll go." Julia had an appointment with the Russian countess, and she could not keep her waiting. "Don't be such a baby," she said. "There's no route to settle. You must go direct to Paris by Bordeaux, of course. I don't think I'm going with you. You had better come back afterwards. Goodbye." "Goodbye? She's gone. She settled everything coming here, and we didn't come by Bordeaux at all. I can't go without Julia. Why, there may be something to decide when I get there. I shall wait until she comes back. She's only driving, I dare say." Todger Phipson went out, met a companion, and took a stroll in the forest. When he came back, he found a note instead of his wife. "The Countess must be in Paris tonight, so I have gone with her. We shall go on to London, and I hope to meet you at Mr. White's at 6 o'clock on the 31st. "But which way am I to go?" Todger Phipson's legs trembled so that he sank in a sofa, while his hands buried themselves in his beard. "There's Calais, and there's Dieppe. I can no more decide which way I go than I can overtake Julia. Why, it's worse than it was before. She's decided everything for more than 2 months, and I couldn't do it if I tried." He sat with the time book before him, but it was no use. Then he thought he'd sleep on it. "It may settle itself while I'm asleep." He overslept himself and lost the early train. When he got to Paris, he lost another while he was trying to decide between Dieppe and Calais, and finally reached Calais after the boat had started. "Well, Julia will be there," he said, "and Julia will do much better than I shall." And Mrs. Todger Phipson reached Mr. White's house in good time, and found not Mr. Todger Phipson, but what will be seen hereafter. Of the second lady's French husband who crossed the Alps in a storm. Mon Dieu, it is impossible, it is frightful, terrific, it will never abate, this terrible storm. The speaker, a slender, fair-haired, and sallow-complexioned Frenchman, was twisting his frame and his face into all manner of possible contortions at the window of a small hotel. The hotel was the Hotel de la Poste, and the place Airolo, a village on the Italian side of the great St. Gothard. It wasn't a pleasant sight he was gazing at. Snow was pelting down in large flakes, beating against the casement, where the Frenchman stood grinning savagely and flattening his nose against the glass in a vain attempt to see even across the street. Occasionally a great cloud of snow, carried into the air like a whirlwind, completely darkened the atmosphere, while the wind howled loud and fearfully, shaking the little hostelry to its foundation. "Ah, sacre, it is impossible," he reiterated, after performing a sort of maniacal evolution around the room. "Fate is against me. It is not for myself I care. I could do it by myself, moi, but for my pauvre Thérèse. Let me see what she says again, ma chère petite femme." He pulled a black-edged letter out of his pocket and laid it before him, resting his elbows on the table and threading his fingers through his hair. "Mon cher ami," it commenced, "you must return to England at once. My old Uncle White has died quite suddenly, leaving a most extraordinary will. We shall be entitled to a large sum of money, ever so many thousands, provided we are present at his house on the 31st of January. He died on Christmas Day, but we shan't get a penny if we are not. Haste home then, dearest. Great good fortune awaits us. You need never work again. Pray don't stop an instant after receiving this, as one day's delay would ruin all our hope. Your faithful wife, Thérèse Bernhardt." The letter was dated 1st January 1869, and this was the 25th, only 6 days before the promised distribution, and there he was, storm-bound and helpless, the frowning peaks of the St. Gothard between him and independence. Émile Bernhardt had been detained for more than a week at Milan on important business, but allowed himself sufficient time to reach England by the date in question. The weather was clear and fine, the road, though dangerous, not impassable. Diligences were still running from Magadino to Airolo, but on his arrival in one the previous night he found, to his horror and dismay, a terrific fall of snow had completely blocked up the pass. In vain he stormed and danced and raved. Mine host only pointed up to the great white mountains and down to the great white valley, and shrugged his shoulders with an air of hopeless commiseration. No horse could struggle up that icy steep, no guide risk his life on such a journey in such a night, so Emile was fain to tarry a night at the little albergo, and find, with the morrow's dawn, the snow still falling, steadily, pitilessly, down. It was still falling, Emile still prancing like a caged tiger up and down the room, when a man stole in, silently and noiselessly, seating himself at one of the little breakfast tables on which were placed hot coffee and rolls. Emile stopped and glared at him. The stranger seemed at first to cower beneath his gaze and shrink further back in the shadow of the room. Then, with the politeness which is a foreigner's birthright, he raised his hat. "Bonjour, monsieur." "Bonjour, sacre! Is this what you call bonjour? Sire, it is the diable, it is monstrous." "You seem angry with the mother, mon ami," remarked the stranger, whose accent betrayed him to be Swiss. He was a marked contrast to Emile, his tall, thick-set, stalwart frame besides the lithe, willowy form of the young Frenchman, his face almost preternaturally pale, his eyes large, dark, and deeply sunk, great masses of thick black hair hung over his pallid brow, and despite the apparent coolness of his tones, the glances he cast upon his companion were restless and uneasy. Bernhard was too engrossed with the weather and his particular grievance to pay much heed to the stranger's appearance. "I am angry," he cried. "I must be in England in 4-5 days. It is of the greatest consequence. It is life or death to me. And behold, I am detained by your villainous Alps. Was there ever such misfortune?" Without replying, the Swiss rose up and, going to the window, flung it open. He remained for a moment gazing at the sky, heedless of the wind and the snow, then, closing it, came back to his seat, remarking quietly, "It will be over directly." "And what then?" screamed the excited Frenchman. "What if it is over directly? I cannot get across. Mine host won't let his mules go out. It is knee-deep in snow. It may be days before it thaws, and then I'm ruined, killed, undone." And he went dancing again round and round the room, wringing his white slender hands, clutching his fair light hair. A strange expression passed over the face of the Swiss. "You are afraid," he cried. Bernhard faced him with a bound. "Afraid? Moi foi, no. But I don't know the way. Your St. Gothard is a terrible mountain. He has crevasses, precipices. If it was La Belle France... But I don't know your Alps. I should be lost, killed. Then what would become of my Thérèse?" The Swiss gazed at him steadily. "I'm not afraid, and I'm going over today." "You?" "Yes, I. Why not? If he cannot get horses, he can get guides. I almost know the track myself. The storm will be over soon. They never last very long at a time. See?" he continued, pointing to the window, through which there stole a faint gleam of pale, watery sunshine, while the snowflakes had almost ceased. "See, it is as I say, the storm is at an end. Courage! The pass is safe from men, if not for beasts. It takes a bigger mountain than St. Gothard to frighten me, and we've several hours of daylight good, if you choose to come." The little Frenchman almost flung his arms around him. "Ah, mon ami!" he cried. "You have saved me. I will go with you gladly. Ma pauvre Thérèse, how delighted she will be." It was not difficult to find 2 guides who, for a compensation never offered them before, agreed to see the 2 travelers across the pass as far as Andermatt, from which station they would easily obtain a conveyance to carry them the rest of their journey. The guides were stern, hardy mountaineers. Every inch of the ground was familiar to them from childhood, and they were not likely to be afraid of a little snow. As the Swiss predicted, the storm cleared up, and the sun, straggling out from behind the leaden clouds, gave a wondrous life and brilliancy to the scene so drear and desolate before. It imparted new strength and vigor to Emile Bernhard as, alpenstock in hand, he toiled up after his companions, and when, after an hour's stiff walking, the 4 men rested for a while to gaze at the prospect around them, a burst of awe-struck admiration issued from his lips. On either side, as far as eye could reach, nothing but snow, white, interminable snow. Below them lay the beautiful valley of Canaria, its white fields glistening in the sunlight, the river like a silver chain gliding in and out between its banks, the little hamlets with their snow-clad cottage roofs whence the blue smoke curled up through the calm, pure air, the deep forests of pine and fir stretching far up the mountain-sides. And above and all around them the mighty peaks of the Oberland Alps rested against the sky, crag upon crag, mountain upon mountain, glacier upon glacier, flashing in the sunshine with a splendor that was awful in its grand sublimity, a glory that was almost celestial in its wondrous purity and light. Chain after chain, ridge after ridge, the Alps, like giant warriors crowned with wreaths of pearly clouds and diadems of snow, with breastplates of polished steel and robes of deepest azure, fringed with forest trees, seemed to be guarding the very portal of heaven. And as the rays fell softly on the slopes, tingling the edges with crimson and pink and gold, it seemed as if an angel's hand had but to part the fleecy clouds that hung like a veil between earth and sky to reveal, in all its glorious and eternal beauty, the wonderful city of God. A Catholic and intensely devotional, the whole soul of Emile Bernard was stirred within him. He raised his hat in silent reverence to Him who dwelleth in light inaccessible, and a fervent prayer of praise and adoration rose from his throbbing heart. Through the trembling valley, the Tremont-Dal, onward they sped, their feet now crushing, now sinking in, now slipping over the snow. As the hours went on, the face of nature changed. Dark shadows crept where all had been so bright before. Dull, leaden clouds hovered round the mountains. Impenetrable mists veiled the valley from their view. The pine trees waved their feathery arms like shrouded spectres barring their approach. The noise of falling avalanches echoed through the distant hills. The sullen roar of the mountain torrent as it came tumbling from its cradle on the summit, carrying stones and trees and blocks of ice in its descent, fell on their hearts with a terrible chill. At intervals, crosses of wood, placed there by the piety of man, bade them remember that mournful journey up Cavalry's Mount. The scene was gloomy enough now, but Bernard, light of heart and light of foot, went bounding on, every now and then bursting into a snatch of song, a sweet French chanson learned in early youth. The guides caught the infection. Auf die Alpen, auf die schönen Alpen, burst from their lips. Only the Swiss, Walter Gaspard, travelled on in moody silence, his tall, gaunt figure gliding ghost-like over the snow, his white, scared face and dark, unearthly eyes turned every now and then upon his companion. Suddenly he stopped and uttered a scream. Bernard sprang to his side and seized his arm, fearing he was about to fall, but the Swiss, his whole frame trembling with some fearful emotion, was pointing down to the ground. "Look," he hissed. "It is blood! Blood! It has crept as far as this. Will nothing stamp it out?" And he crushed his feet violently on the snow, which, to Bernard's astonishment, was of a bright crimson hue. It lay in broad red patches over the path, deepening in hue as the Swiss trampled it down. Emile gazed first at him, then at the crimson ground, with undisguised astonishment, till the guide ran up and explained that the Dicernia nivalis, or red snow, was not at all uncommon on the higher Alps. "Ha ha! What a fool I am!" exclaimed the Swiss. "I thought it was blood. How could blood come here?" And he laughed a strange, wild laugh that caused Emile to shudder, he knew not why. They passed the rock that marked the spot where Suwarrow lay down to die, and, faint and exhausted, they claimed for a little while the shelter of the good monks at the hospice, who were only too glad to relieve them with food and wine. In vain the fathers begged of them to stay the night up there, in vain warned them that every mountain sign betokened a coming storm, warned them that the risk to their own lives and those of the guides. But they were determined. It wanted 2 good hours to sunset yet. The descent was comparatively easy. Bidding their entertainers a kind goodbye, and preceded by their guides, the travelers commenced in the descent, hope firing their courage and giving renewed animation to their jaded spirits. The sunlight had all departed as they entered the defile after leaving the hospice, and wet, dreary mizzle blew coldly into their faces and nearly blinded them. The wind, which had previously abated, howled ominously around the beetling crags. A sound like muttered thunder echoed amongst the hills. They could see nothing before them but black, precipitous rocks, solemn snowfields, gloomy ravines, and impenetrable depths. Riven mountains stood out in gaunt relief. Hideous precipices yawned over fearful abysses which the mist but partially concealed from view. The wind swept in sudden gusts, causing the snow to rise like dust, the firs to rock and roar, while the torrent rushed down the black defile like the thunder of artillery. The men, aided by their alpenstocks, moved cautiously on, keeping as close as they could to the rugged, almost perpendicular wall to whose sides they clung to preserve themselves from slipping. Suddenly, Gaspard flung himself on his companion. "Lie down! Quick!" he cried. "See where it comes!" Bernard gazed to where he pointed. At the top of one of the highest mountains arose a cloud of something that looked like smoke. An instant, and an awful mass of white leapt into the air and fell with a terrific crash but a few yards from where they lay. "It is the Staublauinen," cried the Swiss in a voice of anguish when they had recovered from their fright. "The storm is upon us. We are lost." Emile looked around. The guides were nowhere to be seen. Whether they had fallen over the abyss or been crushed beneath the snow, he never knew. The fir and pine trees lay stripped of their bark and twisted like reeds on the path. A hollow, ominous moaning went reverberating down the gorge. The truth burst upon him. They were alone on that terrible mountain, exposed to all the horrors of an alpine storm. To retrace their steps was impossible. To go on seemed equally so. One false move would hurl them to destruction, and to stay where they were was almost certain death. The wind howled round them with terrible rage. The shadows deepened. The mountains seemed to grow nearer and nearer, revealing frightful crevasses in their rugged sides. A howling as of 10,000 demons met their ears, while the shrieks of lost souls seemed to mingle with the blast. Emile staggered along, groping his way by the side of the rugged rock, every gust of wind threatening to blow him over the precipice. A sickening horror fell upon his heart. He dropped on his knees and buried his face in his hands, uttering an agonized prayer for mercy. He felt his last hour had come. Never more would he see home, Thérèse, his own dear land of France. Never more would he hear the voices of his children calling to him in the twilight, never hear the patter of their baby feet, never feel their dewy kisses on his lips. A cold perspiration broke out from every pore in his body when his attention was attracted to the strange behavior of the Swiss, who, standing with uncovered head, his dark hair streaming wildly in the wind, was shouting and gesticulating with all his might. "Ha, ha!" he cried. "So you're coming for me, are you? I thought that I should escape, but you are stronger now than I. Come on, friend or devil, whatever you may be, I am ready for you now." Bernard grasped him by the arm. "Mon Dieu!" he cried. "What would you do? Are you mad, man, that you rave like this?" Gaspard clutched his hand, his eyes flashing, his form dilated. "Hark! Did you hear that scream? That is how he yelled. I can hear his voice above the roaring of the avalanche. He has come for me. Let me go." But Emile's arms were around him, lithe and supple as a cat. He held his companion back till the man quivered like a reed in his embrace. "You think I'm mad," he screamed hoarsely. "But it's all true what I say. I have seen his face in my dreams night after night. I saw him as we came up the mount, peering behind the crags. You didn't see him, but I did. He went before us all the way, and I knew I should meet him here where I killed him." A terrible suspicion crossed Bernard's mind. Was he indeed the companion of a murderer? "Of whom do you speak?" he gasped, when horror permitted him utterance. "Of him, my master, whom I murdered here. Listen," he cried, retreating back into a niche formed in the rocks. "Listen, I will tell you all. I flung him over yonder chasm. I had no mercy on him. I laughed as I heard his shriek for mercy, as I heard the crash, crash, thud, thud of his body on the jagged rock. Didn't you see his blood upon the snow? The Rius won't wash it out. Hark! There's his voice again." "Why did you kill him?" "Why?" laughed the man. "For money. For the beautiful red shining gold. I've got it all here. I've carried it ever since. He's coming for it, but he shan't have it. If I go down, it shall go down too. See?" he cried, tearing open his vest and disclosing 2 leathern bags. "It's all here. Gold, notes, and all. You don't want it?" he continued, suddenly peering into Emil's face. "You wouldn't try to get it from me, would you?" "God forbid!" cried the Frenchman passionately. "I wouldn't touch your cursed gold to save my life. Kneel down and pray for pardon, wretched man. Don't die with this dreadful sin upon your soul." "Pray? I pray?" laughed the Swiss. "What's the good of praying? Can it save us now?" Even as he spoke, the wind came sweeping around the frail shelter where they stood, flinging him upon his back at some distance from Emile and driving the latter, bruised and bleeding, against the rock. The Frenchman clasped his hands. Spent and fatigued, he felt as though all hope was over, that in another moment the whirlwind would carry him over the abyss as he saw it carry the trees and the stones. The Reuss, how it clattered down the steep ravine, how the wind shrieked and moaned and roared, the shrill cry of the Lammergeier sounding above all the storm. The cruel cold pierced him through, the misty drizzle had soaked him to the skin. A strange drowsiness was creeping over his senses. He felt as though he must lie down on the snow and pass from sleep into eternity. Yes, he would struggle no longer. One fervent prayer to heaven for pardon, one sigh for poor Therese, and then his eyes fell on the prostrate form of the Swiss who lay half-stunned almost at the edge of the cliff. How terrible was the fate of that miserable man, dying such a death, unrepentant and unforgiven, with the awful proofs of his guilt hugged to his murderous breast. What if his imagination did not deceive him, if the lost soul of the murdered man really pursued his assassin, if the gold so fearfully obtained were really to prove his ruin? He had read of such things before. All the tales he had ever heard flitted before his brain, and a wild hope gleamed for a moment as he recollected cases in which the giving up of ill-gotten goods had appeased the fury of the evil spirits. He remembered the tale of the prophet Jonah, how the waters were stilled when he was flung overboard. Quick as thought, he precipitated himself upon the Swiss, planting his knee firmly on his chest. Powerful as Gaspard was, the superior training of the Frenchman gave him a double advantage. The man cowered and shrank under his nervous clutch, under the grasp of that small white hand. Emile cried, "Gaspard, I won't harm you. I swear I won't, if you'll do as you're bid. But if you don't, then by heaven you'll go over yonder rock." The Swiss gazed up at him with white, ghastly face, his dark, restless eyes gleaming with fear and dread. Emile went on, "It is that damned gold that is causing our delay. A curse must follow it wherever you go. Give it up. Fling it over the chasm where you flung its owner. It will appease his spirit, and we shall be saved." The Swiss trembled violently. He rose to his knee, Bernard still clutching him with a grasp of iron. "Are you sure?" he whispered. "Are you sure it's the gold he wants and not me? I'd throw it over if I thought—" "Ma foi, do you hesitate?" exclaimed Emile passionately. "Consider but a second, and then you go yourself. Get up, man," he continued, as the Swiss nervously clutched his legs. "Murderer though you be, I want not your blood upon my hands." Staggering like a man in a dream, Gaspard rose to his feet, while the wind and the sleet impeded his movements and drove him against the stupendous wall. Then he unbound the bags from his neck and flung them over the abyss. They heard them go bounding down the gorge, the ringing, clanging of the gold as the bags split open in the descent, clearly distinguished above the storm. The wind shrieked and screamed louder and louder. The torrent roared. A burst of unearthly laughter seemed to shake the hills. The Swiss knelt down amid the snow, trembling and cowed, his face bowed in his hands through which the hot tears trickled, while Emile stood by his side, his eyes raised to heaven. The great God of nature, who holds the seas and the winds in the hollow of his hand, Did he not see their peril, and would he not help them now? Was it reality or only a dream? In the black canopy overhead, there was a little rift of blue, and in the blue there trembled a tiny star. The wind yet swept with unceasing force, but the mist had disappeared, and the mighty Alps were visible now, resting their giant peaks against the sky, snow crest after snow crest, summit after summit, sublime as eternity and as awfully grand. Another 10 minutes of agonized suspense. The clouds rolled away from the valley below, and there beneath their feet, its lights gleaming in the darkness like so many beacons of hope, lay the village of Hospenthal. The rift of blue above grew wider every moment. Thousands of stars peeped out where only one had been before. The snow cast back their living radiance as from a polished sea of glass. The waters multiplied them in 1,000 lovely forms, and now the broad white path was clearly defined, bordered on one side by the beetling crags, on the other by unfathomable gulfs. The wind went sobbing, sobbing amongst the rugged mountains. The fir trees waved their solemn branches in farewell. Almost as swiftly as it came, the storm had passed away. Night lay in all its splendid beauty on the lofty hills. One fervent prayer of thanksgiving for his deliverance, and Emil Bernhard turned to his companion. But the Swiss made no reply to his remarks. Sullen and moody, yet with humbled brow, he motioned to Emil to lead the way, following him at a little distance, as a dog would follow his master after having been chastised. Emil was not afraid of him now. He seemed passive and tractable enough, but the brave little Frenchman shrank from all contact with the murderer, trampling over the pure white snow with the red sin of Cain upon his brow. And now the outskirts of the village are reached, and a welcome cheer replies to his shouts. A party of peasants had come out to meet the travelers, lantern in hand, and conduct them to the hotel. Some police, attracted by the scene, were among the group, and before Walter Gaspard was aware, Emil laid his hand on the collar of his coat. "I give this man in charge," he cried, "upon his own confession of having murdered his master higher up the pass." There was a murmur and shout. 2 men instantly seized the Swiss, but, to Emil's astonishment, he made no resistance, and suffered himself to be led quietly away. The rest followed the Frenchman to the hotel, surrounding him, asking 1,000 questions as to the particulars of his story. Bernard was glad to escape from their friendly hands into those of the landlord of the Meyerhof, who, conducting him to an apartment, supplied him with a change of dry clothes to replace his saturated garments. A warm fire and a hot tumbler of cognac soon restored the exhausted spirits of the Frenchman, and when he entered the salle à manger, prepared to do full justice to the good dinner ready for him, he found the room already occupied by the principal man and officials of the place, who were anxious to receive his deposition. Emil again recounted his story with all its attendant horrors, and at the end was vociferously congratulated on his marvelous escape, while bitter imprecations were launched on the murderous Swiss, and deep regret expressed for the unfortunate guides. A benevolent-looking old gentleman, who had hitherto kept silence, yet appeared to listen with great interest to his story, now asked him if he was sure he and his companion were the only travelers on the mountain. "Ma foi, yes," exclaimed Bernard. "None would be so mad as to risk their lives, except in such a case as mine." "Were there any travelers at the hospice?" "No, the father said no one had been there for more than a week." The old gentleman looked deeply anxious. "You will excuse me," he said to Bernard with a courteous bow, "troubling you so much after your great fatigue. But I am very anxious, as I expected to meet a person here tonight who has not come. I am M. Botzlingen, of the firm of Botzlingen & Co., merchants of Geneva, and the person I expected to meet was our most trustworthy and confidential clerk. Poor fellow, he's been ill for some time at Bellinzona, but he gave his word he would be here without fail tonight." "I saw no such person," cried Emil. "I only wish I had met with such a man." "It is very strange," murmured M. Botzlingen. I trust he's met with no mishap. He was to bring me a large sum in notes and gold." A horrible suspicion flashed over Emil's brain. What if the Swiss was the murderer of the merchant's clerk? What if the gold he had was the money of that unfortunate man? What was his name?" he stammered out. "Walter Gaspard, native of Lucerne." Emile sprang from his seat almost into the air. "Why, that's him! That's the murderer's name!" "He a murderer?" exclaimed M. Botzingen. "You must be mistaken, sir. He wouldn't hurt a fly. He's the most innocent fellow in the world. Only support of his widowed mother and sisters. It's for her sake I've come so far to meet him. Good God! The fever must have shaken his brain. Pray, fetch him in, friends. Don't keep him in custody." It didn't take long for them to reach the little police station where the Swiss was confined and bring him back, manacled and bound, to the inn. It was all true. Walter Gaspard was no murderer at all, only a poor, innocent bagsman whose mind had been affected by his recent illness, the storm and the danger completing the mischief. It was M. Botzingen's money he had flung down the abyss, and the story he told was a pure fabrication, the result of a diseased imagination. As he stood there now, his hands bound, his eyes, from which the light of reason had forever fled, resting lovingly and piteously on his master, tears dimmed the sight of many a hardy mountaineer, while M. Botzingen was visibly affected. "It is not for the loss of gold I care," he cried, flinging himself into a chair and clasping his hands, "but for this poor lad and his widowed mother. God have pity on her." 3 days later, Emile Bernhard was clasped to the heart of his dear Therese, whose tears flowed fast as he recounted the story of his peril on the mountain, while her faithful heart beat with rapture at his return. But not all the joy of seeing her and his children, not all the prospect of certain wealth, could obliterate from his mind the horrors of that fearful night, nor hide from his view that white, scared face and dark, wild, restless eyes that he left behind on the Oberlin Alps, and whose memory would haunt him to his dying day. As to the certain wealth, however, something very remarkable has yet to be related. I think Todger's indecision is meant to be funny and maybe even charming, but of course by this point it just becomes a little annoying. He isn't that incompetent. Earlier in the story, he successfully made his way to France for that job. He clearly knows the way. Speaking of which, the story goes ahead and introduces the extraordinary Marquise de Roche, who has the earring and the white hair and the gold snuff box and the farm animals in his sitting room. I was so interested in that character, and he did nothing. It reminds me of Game of Thrones, where Martin introduces new characters with these incredibly deep descriptions and backstories and motivations just to, kill them on the next page. I found that maddening. Anyway, maybe we'll see the Marquise again. Also, isn't the sudden simultaneous death of all the husbands a bit suspicious? So even though Todger is kind of annoying, the story of the Alps crossing is fantastic. I found it so gripping. I was all set up for horror and murder, but the guy was just crazy and made up the whole wild story. But then, sacrificing the money did calm the storm. Or was it just coincidence? A quick note, because I was curious about red snow or watermelon snow. This story calls it Dicernia nivalis, but Wikipedia calls it Chlamydomonas nivalis. Anyway, it's a form of algae that thrives in the snowfields. In warm weather, it's green and it's growing during spring and summer. And then when winter comes, its chlorophyll decreases and it builds up a red carotenoid pigment, and it becomes a sort of dormant red cyst that allows it to survive over the winter. The red color attracts light and warmth and might allow individual algae cells to slightly melt nearby ice and snow crystals in order to access water. Under some circumstances, an algae bloom can turn huge amounts of the snow red, or the cells can get crushed under pressure, creating like red footprints in the snow as a person walks on it. As I mentioned in the first part, I'm going to save the factual research about this annual until the end of the series. Right now, I'm just letting the story unfold as it is written. If you listen all the way to the end of the video, you get to hear me make a little confession. Tonight's confession is that I'm working on this story while eating Thanksgiving leftovers, but it's like the second day of leftovers. That means all the best bits got eaten yesterday, and of course some were given away since there was so much. So now I'm at the stage where there's like a lot of cranberry sauce and mashed potatoes, but of course you can still make a lunch out of these things. I also made a really lovely harvest punch for Thanksgiving, and I highly recommend it. The recipe calls for about a liter of apple juice, a liter of ginger beer, and a bottle of Prosecco with 8 cinnamon sticks, 3 sliced apples, and 2 sliced oranges, served over ice with a cinnamon sugar rimmed glass. Of course, if you wanted it more potent, you could add some vodka, but I wanted to keep it pretty light. I think my version was a bit better because a few days before Thanksgiving, I started infusing the apple juice with sliced fruit and cinnamon, but also with some clove and some cardamom and allspice and other warming holiday spices. So it was really fragrant and lovely before I added the ginger beer and the Prosecco, just before serving so they would maintain their sparkle. It was absolutely delicious. I mention it because, of course, afterward, I had all this fruit and whole spices, so today I'm simmering all that stuff down with water into a syrup, and it is making the kitchen smell fantastic. I love making syrups. It's a great use for old fruit and peels and whatnot, and then the syrup can be kept in the fridge and used for cocktails, or heated up and drunk as a tea, or just added to sparkling water to make something a little bit special. If you like imprecise recipes and weird old stories, you have come to the right place, and you should subscribe to the channel. At Restored Lore, I find old, odd, obscure stories, and I share them with you, and if you subscribe, you won't miss anything. Please also drop me a like on this video to help other people find the channel, and consider using the link below to buy me a coffee. Thank you so much for all your support, and I will see you in a few days.